known as the Little Giant. I think he was like 5'4". Yeah. Short guy. Enormous booming voice. Has a presence about him. And in 1854, Senator Stephen A. Douglas of Illinois, he kind of has a counter idea to offset the Gadsden Purchase, because he wants to thwart southern expansion westward. And the Little Giant, Stephen A. Douglas, had also heavily invested in real estate around the city of Chicago. And a railroad that went from San Francisco and east to Chicago, what would that do to the value of his real estate? Skyrocket. So he was very eager to have the Windy City become like the eastern terminus for the proposed railroad westward. He wanted it to be like, that's where, if you want to go to California, you got to start in Chicago. That would be like where you start from. So, in order to do this, though, if you just kind of look the distance here between Chicago, which is here where my red dot is, right here on the banks of Lake Michigan, and you go westward, you have to go through a significant portion of this purple territory. What's the problem with that? This territory is not organized. There's not a lot of federal troop presence. In fact, it's largely inhabited by Native Americans. Okay? Now, there are some white settlements there, but it's largely inhabited by Native Americans. And there's not a lot of federal troop presence. And so it would be difficult to keep the railroad workers and the railroading industry safe from attack during this time period. So, before a railroad could logically be constructed, this territory needs to be organized. That's the term for it, organized, meaning it has to have some laws and has to have some bureaucracy set up there. So, the Kansas-Nebraska Act is what Stephen A. Douglas comes up with. It splits this territory into two things, because this was all one territory, okay? The Kansas-Nebraska Act splits it into two, one being Kansas, the other being Nebraska. Obviously, Kansas and Nebraska are much smaller than this today, as this territory has been divided into several other states. Now, what this proposed act would do is split this territory into two, Kansas and Nebraska. And in order to get Southern support, what must he try to accommodate? Because ultimately, what's he trying to do? What's his ultimate goal? Get the railroad. Okay, now, does the South already have a good chance at that? Do you think it's going to be difficult to get the South on board for his plan? Yes. So what is something that he needs to do? That's right. He has to make something to generate support for slavery. Okay, and particularly in the South. So, how will slavery be determined in these two territories? Popular sovereignty. They're going to allow for people to determine for themselves if slavery will exist or not. What's the problem with that? Okay, is there any laws that exist about determining where slavery can and cannot exist? What is that law? It is the line that was created out of what compromise? The Missouri Compromise of 1820. Well, if you look here, here's the line. What about this territory? If this is the line, this is 36 degrees, 30 minutes. Every single square inch of this territory is above that line. So another thing that the Kansas-Nebraska Act does is it abolishes and replaces the Missouri Compromise of 1820. So now it's kaput because of this. So it repeals the ancient, the 34-year-old Missouri Compromise, and allows for slavery to exist in places where the people want it to. And that is called popular sovereignty. So to many Southerners, they see this as an opportunity to gain more slave territory. The President of the United States at this time was who in 1854? Franklin Pierce. And he is a he's a Northern, but pro-Southerner, okay? So he was easy to sway. He was pliable. And he threw his full weight behind the Kansas-Nebraska bill. So this Kansas-Nebraska Act is serving several different purposes. One, trying to make this guy rich. Two, trying to get a northern railroad. Three, it opens up more territory to debate over slavery. It's a good thing slavery is not a, hot button issue anyways, right? It's very much debated. Okay. All right, so let me shift gears a little bit. And we're going to come back to the Kansas-Nebraska Act because it leads to some really interesting stuff. First, I want to talk about this lady and something she wrote. Who's that woman? Harriet Beecher Stowe. And in the year 1852, she writes a book. And that book is called Uncle Tom's Cabin. You ever heard of it? It's a pretty famous book in American history. This is Harriet Beecher Stowe is a Northerner, and she is a very much big supporter of the abolitionist cause. She wants to see slavery done away with. So she writes this book about basically a family of slaves. And she uses very powerful writing and paints very vivid pictures in the reader's imagination by using powerful imagery to, basically lay out how inhumane, unfair, immoral, and cruel slavery is. And her book becomes wildly popular. Wildly popular. Being the second most published book in the United States in this antebellum period. Number one being the Bible. Okay? All right, so this book was not just a success in America, it was a success really worldwide. Hundreds of thousands of copies were published in the first year. Pretty soon it ran into the millions of copies. It's not too difficult to locate an original Uncle Tom's Cabin, as so many were circulated. It would be very valuable if you had one. 10 years after she wrote this book, the United States is in the midst of the Civil War. And Harriet Beecher Stowe is invited to the White House to meet the president, and that was President Lincoln at the time. And when President Lincoln meets her, he just extends his hands and he says, "I'd just like to shake the hand of the little woman who's responsible for this war." Now, he's kidding. Abraham Lincoln was renowned for having a sense of humor. But what does he mean by that? What is the gist of his joke?
I need Alexis Crump to the office, please. Alexis Crump to the office, please.
What does it mean? I didn't hear you, Gracie. Yeah, it totally motivated people. It did help start the Civil War, and really it also helped to win it. The South condemned that. Now the South hated Harriet Beecher Stowe. They called her the vile wretch in petticoats. What a lovely nickname. And she writes this in particularly after the fugitive slave law comes out in 1850, and she writes it kind of in response to that. So it's a wildly successful novel, and it definitely brings to light the evils of slavery, in particular the evils of the slave trade. Families being torn apart and sold on auction blocks, children being ripped from their mother's arms. These are all, and she paints very vivid imagery in her book, in particular about the slave auction. Okay? All right. So, I wanted to go back to talk about Kansas. I wanted to throw Harriet Beecher Stowe's book in there because it's important. And it's also happening around the same time. Okay, after the Kansas-Nebraska Act is passed, some things happen in the United States, a series of events in which we now refer to as Bleeding Kansas. Bleeding Kansas. Why do you think it's called Bleeding Kansas? Yeah. How they die? Polio?
A fight?
Violence. Okay?
Oh, there's a fool. And it's true. I think that wasn't my right.
Yellow? Okie doke. Laura, you're up. Science fair. Good luck. Okay. All right, so
Wait, we're in a group. Do they just get
it's a group project.
Group,
No,
yeah.
they'll probably call you down in a few seconds.
You go on ahead.
What, go ahead?
I mean, are you? Is she your partner?
Yeah, she's my partner.
Berg. Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know.
They just made a mistake, I'm sure. Okay. I'm sure the phone's going to ring in about 3 seconds.
Whoa, that was good.
Yellow,
I need Michaela Mann also.
on her way.
You didn't want to say bye.
All right. Bleeding Kansas. Look at this guy.
Cool.
Well, it's not a photograph. It's a portrait.
Oh.
It's art. It's not. There's no dude with a camera. Okay. Who is that?
Cool dude.
He is a cool dude. If you like, crazy people. That's John Brown.
Oh, that one?
That's John Brown. Now, John Brown is a very key central figure to starting the Civil War for multiple reasons. Now, you probably know of the John Brown at Harper's Ferry, Virginia, which is today Harper's Ferry, West Virginia. But before that, he was in Kansas, and he was causing some, I don't want to say problems, but he was up to no good. Yeah. All right, so John Brown was from Ohio. He's an Ohioan. And he is an extremely ardent abolitionist, meaning he's very strict about abolition. When he hears that the Kansas-Nebraska Act had passed and that slavery has the potential to continue to exist in Kansas when Kansas applies for statehood, and they're going to allow the people to vote as to whether slavery is going to exist or not, he decides that he's going to go to Kansas and speak out. So, before he's able to get there, there's already violence erupting in Kansas. And the violence is really happening in like newspaper offices. Pro-slavery newspaper offices versus abolitionist newspaper offices. They print their own newspapers and they print their own take on the story. And both of them are being attacked. Editors are being, tarred and feathered. Newspaper offices are being torched and burned to the ground. There is violence happening. And this violence is all due to one reason, and that is slavery. So, and this is before they've even voted, okay? Now, when the day comes in 1855, when Kansas gets to determine whether there will be free or slave, it's chaotic. I don't know if you guys are aware about how voter registration works today, but it's pretty accurate on how voters are registered. There's no digital database in 1855 as to who's registered or not. And people pour in from other places to vote. There were a lot of people from Missouri that voted, and Missouri is a slave state. There were a lot of people that came from Nebraska. They just crossed the border and voted. And this is not necessarily the illegal election, okay? So, and after the election happens, there's two results, because one group of people were tallying one way and another group it's a mess. It is an absolute mess. And John Brown hears of this violence that's going down in Kansas. So he packs up his family, his adult sons, they're grown, and they move from Ohio to Kansas. When he arrives, he has a violent intent in his heart. When he hears about a newspaper office, an abolitionist newspaper office being burned to the ground, he seeks out the alleged offenders who did the crime. He wants to find them. And he gets word that they are camped out on the side of a creek called Pottawatomie Creek. It's written up there. Pottawatomie Creek. So he and his band of followers wait till the campers are sleeping and go into their campsite, draw their swords, and hack them to pieces. Pieces. Why would he do that? Slavery. He is anti-slavery. This is butchery. This is violence. You could make the argument that the Civil War started in Kansas in 1856. There's people killing each other regularly. Kansas was crazy. Millions of dollars of damage. Things being burned down, entire towns destroyed. You build everything out of wood, one building catches on fire. Pretty soon, the wind blows the right way, it'll burn the whole place down. Agriculture paralyzed. Scores of lives lost. All thanks to Stephen A. Douglas. Thanks, Steve. I thought popular sovereignty was going to save the Union. Does it? It leads to murder. People are killing each other over this. Good on paper, not so good in practice. So, this is, it's a horrific beginning, and it's a horrific period in American history. And John Brown is a central key figure in it, and he's not done. He's not done with the violence. He still has to come back to Harper's Ferry. So, this is not the only example of violence leading up. Guys, what we're doing here, like what we've been doing this whole week, I want you to imagine that we are the United States and everybody's together. All the states are together, 30 states. And eventually the union's going to split. But in order to get from being the United States to not being the United States, several things have to happen. You can't just point and say it's slavery and that's why. Because that's not entirely true. You got violence in Kansas. You got the Kansas-Nebraska Act. You got people killing each other. You got Harriet Beecher Stowe writing novels that are upsetting people in the South. You got the Mexican-American War and what we should do over the territory. The Wilmot Proviso. We're building a bridge. And this entire bridge has to be constructed before we can actually say, hey, we're splitting apart. Okay? All right, so another thing that happens that leads to the split in our nation, it actually happens in the United States Senate. In the United States Senate. This happens in 1856. President Pierce was out. James Buchanan, I should say, was in. And needless to say, there was talk of bleeding Kansas on everyone's tongue in the United States Senate and House. People of the North, like Charles Sumner, a senator from Massachusetts, tall, imposing figure. This is him right here. He was a leading figure and an abolitionist, meaning he wants to see slavery come to an end. He's a shrewd guy, but he has a sharp tongue and can insult people very harshly. And he says some things that are very offensive to people of the South on the floor of the Senate. Like calling pro-slavery men, I think his actual words were like hirelings picked from the drunken spew and vomit of an uneasy civilization. Calls people like a puke face. Pretty mean. Okay? And he directs this at another one of his senator friends from South Carolina, who was one of the best-liked senators in the Senate, actually, from North or South. Okay. So, an insult is made in public. A man's honor is at stake. But the man he insults is elderly and old. Fortunately for that elderly old man who is insulted, he has a very hot-tempered young nephew who's in the House of Representatives. And his name is Preston Brooks. And this is him. Preston Brooks resented the insults of his friend and cousin, and he believed that his honor called for a duel. Dueling was illegal. So, Preston Brooks takes matters into his own hands. He enters the United States Senate while it's in session, carrying his cane, and proceeds to beat Charles Sumner in the head with his cane until it breaks.
Did he bust his head open?
He causes brain damage, almost kills him.
Didn't he get didn't someone from I think it was in South, bought him a new cane with
Hundreds of new canes showed up at his front door to replace the one he broke in support. Okay. I want you to imagine somebody running up in the U.S. Senate and bashing a senator in the head with a cane. Almost to death. And then you just go home. Can you imagine that? It happened. The injuries to Charles Sumner's head were serious. He had to go to Europe and get treatments to his central nervous system and brain for 3.5 years. If you're a Northerner, what's your response to this? Yeah, look, Sophie, you are outraged. How could this be allowed? All he did was insult him. Isn't this America? Freedom of speech, right? If you were a Southerner, what is your response to this? Yeah. Show those Yankees how it's done. You are seeing violence occur in one of the most sacred houses of America. People almost being murdered. All over disagreements on the issue of slavery. This is just kind of a microcosm of how dangerously passions have been inflamed between the North and the South. So in essence, we're laying another plank on the bridge. It's just another thing we can point to. This is, hey, this is we're leading to war. It's not inevitable, but we're on the road to war. Okay? So I found this. Ultimately, that's what it's about. Different opinion. Just beat them. Just beat them. Okay. All right. Next election is the election of 1856. You would think that the Democrats would run the incumbent again, but they kicked Franklin Pierce out. He was just that like he was kind of switching sides all the time. So they choose someone else. They choose an Alabama senator named Rufus. President Rufus. Doesn't that sound great? We need to find somebody named Rufus. All right. So the Democrats shied away from President Pierce. They also shied away from another prominent Democrat, Stephen A. Douglas, in the election of 1856. And the delegates chose James Buchanan, which he would correct you if you said Buchanan. It's Buchanan. Buchanan. His nickname, Old Buck. We call him Old Buck. James Buchanan, white-haired, 6 feet tall, short neck, protruding chin. Whenever he'd look at you, he'd look at you like this because he had an eye defect. So he's always looking at you kind of cockeyed. So he always carried his head one way. He's a Pennsylvanian. He's a lawyer. And he had been out of the country during this whole Kansas-Nebraska thing. He was actually in London acting as like a minister to Great Britain.
So he knew nothing.
And he knew about it, but he wasn't around to make any enemies. So he was Kansasless. He didn't have an opinion. He hadn't put forth one. So, as opposed to like hot-headed people like Stephen A. Douglas who forceful with their opinions, Old Buck, quiet, mediocre, irresolute, and often confused. Sounds like a great president. One of the worst presidents in American history, James Buchanan. He runs against Captain John C. Fremont on a newly formed young Republican Party. And their party platform was all about the resistance to the expansion of slavery in the territories. While Democrats, when it came to slavery and its extension, what did they say? What was their party platform? What were Democrats going to use to determine the extension of slavery? Popular sovereignty. So the Republicans said, no slavery extension, period. Democrats said, we're going to use popular sovereignty. So which side is going to favor, so the South is going to favor which side? Yeah, the Democrats, because they have the slight potentiality to have it. Millard Fillmore, he's running in there again. Poor Millard. At least he got Maryland. Yeah, he won Maryland. But as you can see, it's a pretty sweeping victory for Buchanan. And like most presidential elections, a lot of mudslinging for both candidates. James Buchanan was a bachelor. He was not married. One of the items of mudslinging was that he was homosexual. He had been engaged to a woman, and his fiance died after they got into a fight. So, it was not like his fault, but she just died after they got into an argument. So they're gonna try to paint him as a murderer.
Wait, so they were like arguing and she just dropped?
No, it was like they had an argument and then they parted ways, and then before they saw each other again, she died. Okay, so the biggest thing that the Democrats said against Fremont, the worst thing that they said about him was that he was Catholic. Which is going to upset a lot of people. All right, so James Buchanan wins 174 to 114. And begins one of the worst presidencies in American history. And they get it off to a pretty rough start with a Supreme Court decision involving the Chief Justice of the United States Supreme Court at that time. The man on the left, his name's Roger Taney, Taney. Taney. And the man on the right, a slave by the name of Dred Scott, Dred Scott. The decision made by the Taney Supreme Court is a bombshell. It blows everything to smithereens. And it comes down on March the 6th, 1857, on the second day of James Buchanan's presidency. This pronouncement, which I'm going to go over with you in great detail, you could make the argument it is a paper gun blast, the opening paper blast of the Civil War. If they were shooting guns made of paper, this is the biggest one they had. The case is basically simple. Dred Scott was a slave. He lived with his master for 5 years in the state of Illinois and the Wisconsin Territory, both of which are free places. Wisconsin Territory, no slavery allowed. Illinois is a state, no slavery allowed. So Dred Scott, backed by wealthy abolitionists, obviously, sued for his freedom on the basis that he's a resident of a free soil place. He lives in a place where slavery is not allowed. Does everybody understand the case? Does he have a case? I mean, if he's a slave, he's living in a place where slavery is not allowed, I think he's got a case. So it cannot, it goes back and forth in lesser courts. Ultimately, it goes to the Supreme Court of the United States. And the Supreme Court takes this case, which is relatively simple, and twists it. They get political with it. And it ruled, to a lot of people's surprise, that Dred Scott is a slave, not a citizen. Therefore, he doesn't even have the right to have access to courts. So they said that he was a slave, not a citizen, so therefore he doesn't have the right to sue anybody. That's not all. That because he is not a citizen and he is a slave, he is property. He is property. And any law that restricts a person's property is unconstitutional. Therefore, saying that laws like the Missouri Compromise of 1820 is unconstitutional. You can't restrict where you can own property. What are the implications of this Supreme Court case? Sophie?
That every state should be a slave.
Every state can have slavery. What about Massachusetts? Yes. Even if it's illegal in that state, it makes all those laws unconstitutional because it violates, according to the Supreme Court, the Fifth Amendment, which protects a citizen's right to property. So the Dred Scott case defines slaves as inhuman and property. And they can't do anything about it because they're not allowed access to courts. Do you think this upset some people? Do you think this made some people like jubilant and like dancing in the street? Yeah. And the only difference was where you lived. This was a big, big deal. This was a massive victory for Southerners, while it infuriated Northerners. And it infuriates supporters of popular sovereignty. Because they're like, hey, well, we should just let the people decide. Okay? Dred Scott Supreme Court case. It's the name of the case is actually Dred Scott versus Sanford. That was the name of his master that he sued for his freedom. But we just call it the Dred Scott case. Okay? Questions? Very good.